Hi students, this week we are reading Cynthia Freeland's Gender Genius and Guerilla Girls from her 2001 book, But Is It Art? So this essay, and the one we'll read by Ahume Wingo, gets us to think about the social institutions surrounding art. So one of the things we're doing is we're trying to situate the work of art in terms of other sort of social political relationships. So we're thinking about how art builds and sustains existing social institutions, things like race, ethnicity, gender orientation, and all sorts of things. But we're also thinking about how art challenges or subverts those social institutions. So how do artists play a role in shifting social institutions? And we're also thinking about the sort of context in which we situate works of art, whether they have to be understood in terms of the identity of the artist, whether they have to be understood within the specific cultural context that that artist is situated within, or if there's something beyond that. So Cynthia Freeland is an American philosopher. She's still living, and she is a very important person within contemporary philosophy of art. In this book, But Is It Art?, she spends a chapter talking about the concept of genius, and she talks about whether or not gender and sexual orientation of the artist is important to understanding that work of art. And she gives us a complex answer where she says yes and no. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So she begins with two very dramatically different examples. We have artists like Georgia O'Keeffe who wanted to just be treated like artists rather than a woman artist. And in many ways, Georgia O'Keeffe's work has been kind of overly treated as feminist art, which is not how she saw it. And so sometimes people overemphasize the sort of vaginal imagery or the femininity of Georgia O'Keeffe's art as if her being a woman artist is the most important part of interpreting it. And a lot of meaning gets lost when you're reading Georgia O'Keeffe that way. By contrast, we have artists like Judy Chicago, who very much want to be read as women artists contributing to the women's movement. So the dinner party, which Judy Chicago put together in 1979, is one of the first epic feminist art installations. It is a triangular table, and there is a place setting that represents famous women in history. So it's drawing attention to famous women. And then on top of that, the place setting that represents each woman is an image of female genitalia. So there's lots of different sort of vaginas on the table. And so Judy Chicago is emphasizing the female form in this way that would have been really important to 1970s feminist movements, but now is considered way too essentialist. We no longer treat what it means to be woman in terms of biological body parts, especially genitalia. That's no longer cool. And so Judy Chicago's sort of feminist statement within this art is very strong, but it's also kind of dated. It's very 70s feminism and not 2020 feminism. And so people like Judy Chicago are like, yes, I'm a woman artist. I'm creating women art. Here it is. So to talk about this question of whether it matters if the woman is an artist or not, Freeland addresses one of the most famous sort of feminist art theory essays, Linda Nochlund's 1971 essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? And this is a question that someone asked Nochlund and was like, why are there no great women artists? And she took that question very seriously. Instead of trying to find lots of instances of women artists who were great throughout history, which is sort of just a way of always trying to compare women to male artists. So Nalkin took this very seriously, and she looked at the different social inequalities that women face. The fact that they were not allowed to paint nudes, and there was a period in which you couldn't be a great artist if you weren't painting nudes. So they didn't have the same access to education. They didn't have the same access to patronage. They didn't have the same access to all sorts of things that would have made them great artists. So she thinks we need to look at the social institutions that allow there to be artists. If we're only focusing on individuals, we don't really see the circumstances that allow those individuals to create art in the first place. And so she looks at certain ideas like genius and the myth of the great artist as something that emphasizes individual talent and forgets where that talent came from, had to do with a community, had to do with your relation to other social institutions, and not just something you're born with. So we get this idea of genius from different sources, but the way that it's used in the art world is highly influenced by the Enlightenment thinker Immanuel Kant. For Kant, genius is this innate talent. That means you're born with it. No one can give it to you. No one can make you a genius or teach you how to be a genius. And the other thing is that genius is a sort of thing that gives other people rules. So a genius is someone who looks within themselves and creates new rules for art. And then other artists follow them. So they're the original rule maker who breaks the rules to make new ones. And then all the other artists imitate them and are able to create beautiful art because they're imitating that genius. So the way that Freeland describes it is geniuses are people who are path breaking. They reshape our perceptions. And when we see a work of genius, it evokes awe and admiration. So this is something that Roger Scruton talked about in his essay that we read previously, is that there's a sort of cult that forms around geniuses. Geniuses create great art. But the thing is, when this idea is being born, it's only applied to men, and the philosophers who talk about genius think that only men can be geniuses. So Rousseau says only men can be geniuses because you have to have great passion to be a genius. And Kant says, no, it's actually the opposite. Women have too much passion and they don't know how to kind of rein it in, and that genius is about duty and autonomy and freedom and reason and the highest things that humans possess. And women don't really have that. You know, sometimes they get a little bit of it if they have like a husband or a father who can help them develop that, but they don't have it. And so in Enlightenment and in Romantic philosophy, only men are geniuses, which mean only men get to create great art. The other aspect of why genius ends up kind of being misogynistic and more of an indication of social relations and not some sort of innate spark that you have is that we see how much genius actually excuses behavior that only men are allowed to engage in. So if you look at great artists, a lot of time people say things like, oh, genius and madness are closely aligned. Like, look at this madness, look at this strange behavior. So Van Gogh chopped off his ear. And there were artists who would just like abandon their families, abandon all their responsibilities, and kind of go on a drug fueled art rage somewhere in a foreign country. And there's lots of alcoholism, lots of drug use, lots of womanizing and mood swings, and all sorts of things associated with being an artistic genius. And again, Freeland's pointing out, well, you know, men were allowed to engage in this behavior and women were not. So the other thing we have to look at when we're thinking about why women have been so excluded from the art world is not just because of this concept of genius being very much a concept that we think applies to men, but it's also has to do with this idea of a canon, a sort of established set of great works of art that everything else gets compared to. So the word canon comes from this Greek word that means like a rule or ruler, a sort of measurement, and it's an exemplary model for how to do something. And the first example we have of a canon is Polyclitus and his way of creating sculpture. He apparently figured out the ideal proportions that sculptures should be, and everyone else would imitate his sculpture and the sort of proportions he provided so that they could create beautiful works of art too. So if we're always looking at the past and what someone has established as being beautiful or great in the past, we're going to end up reinforcing it if we repeat it over and over and over. And so Freeland says that canons get entrenched. We see this in classes, we see this in textbooks and bibliographies, what gets cited, what doesn't get cited. We see this in institutions, what gets included, what gets attention or doesn't get attention. And all of this reinforces the public's view about what counts as quality in a field. And so it's this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're only setting up and exemplifying great works of art made by men and saying that's great, and then you're using that as the model of comparison for everything else, right? So that creates this very entrenched view that only men's works of art matter, and women can only create something that's lesser in quality or comparable or a watered down version of it. So there's two different approaches to challenging the masculine male man canon in art history. The Guerilla Girls take the approach of adding women to the canon. So that's the idea that you can add and stir and mix it up, and then you're going to have more equality, that it's about including women in the canon. And so they look at lost and forgotten great women artists. There's all sorts of women in the Renaissance. Sometimes they were tortured. They would express their sort of torture in their works of art. So there's lots of different women we can include to the canon. And then the other approach is to question the idea of what a canon is, because it inherently is hierarchical. A canon says this thing is great, it's exemplary, and it excludes things that are not great. And so a lot of arts that a lot of women have participated in throughout history, such as quilt making or pottery, sometimes get called craft rather than art. So sometimes the very ideas and sort of objects we have within the canon are creating exclusion. So adding women to the canon doesn't work if the canon itself is messed up. So if you think painting is great, but pottery is not, you're going to automatically end up disregarding a lot of the contributions that women could make to the art world. So Freeland she ends her essay by coming back to this question of whether the gender of the artist matters or not. And she says yes and no. It definitely does matter if we want to include more women in the museum. It definitely matters when we're thinking about issues of representation. But when it comes to interpreting works of art, it really depends on the work of art. So some works of art, if we focus too heavily on the fact that the artist is a woman, we're going to miss out on some of the other meanings that are there. And we might sort of misinterpret something as being simply about being a woman, right? Women can contribute all sorts of thoughts. It's not just about being a woman every time a woman speaks. And so for that reason, maybe we don't need to overemphasize the artist as a woman. But in other cases, the work of art might be some sort of point about politics or some sort of feeling that comes from a specific type of emotion that the artist is experiencing as a woman. And in that case, their identity might matter a lot. So it's a very complex issue, and it's not something that can be simply resolved in one way and one way only. So I'm very interested in your thoughts about this, and to help you think about women artists and how women should be included in the canon, or if we should just scrap the canon, or how women have made a difference in the art world, I've assigned some videos for you to think about this. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you for listening.